Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming out. Welcome to the second annual McGill Max Bell lecture series. My name is Andrew Potter. I'm the interim director of the Max Bell School of Public Policy at McGill University. And I'd like to begin tonight by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, including the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, Stolo, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. This lecture series, this is the second year we've done this, and it was made possible thanks to a generous donation from Mr. Tom Cairns, who's a McGill University graduate, but he's also, probably more importantly, one of Canada's most respected business leaders, and has been the director of and chairman of many successful national and international companies. And I understand that when Mr. Cairns first brought the idea of this series to Max Bell's then director, my predecessor, Chris Reagan, the focus of the lecture series was about the need to have better debates about Canadian fiscal policy very narrowly. They wanted to talk about deficits, debts, taxes, and so on. And Chris, I think, over the course of their discussions about the lecture series and the donation, Chris managed to convince Mr. Cairns that they needed to sort of broader things out a little bit and to focus more on economic policy more generally. And so hence the actual subtitle of this series is Economic Ideas for a Stronger Canada. And part of the implementation of that is that these lecture series take place each year. There are 3 lectures, and they take place in 3 different cities across Canada. There's always one in the West, one in Montreal, and another one in a city that has some sort of connection to the topic at hand. We do a lot at the Max Bell School of Public Policy. We have an MPP program. If anybody wants to talk about it, I'll be around after if you feel like getting a pitch on doing a master's in public policy. We have partnerships with think tanks, we do public events, but this lecture series, we're hoping, is our marquee public event. And while there's not a lot of glory in being an interim director, I'm the interim director for 4 months, one of the pleasures it's given me is the opportunity to serve as the host of this year's series. And so the vision of these lectures is to highlight a critical policy issue in the Canadian economy. One that is of pressing importance, but which we're either not thinking enough about, or if we are thinking a lot about it, we're thinking about it in the wrong ways. It's also designed to serve as a platform for thinkers who are not yet necessarily household names, but who have achieved a level of accomplishment and respect in their field that we believe the public interest would be well served by a wider promotion of their ideas. And finally, the vision of this series is to publish simultaneously with the lectures a book that promotes the main themes and arguments of the authors in a manner that's accessible to the broader public. And our publishing partner again this year is Sutherland House, which is under the direction of Mr. Ken White, former Maclean's editor, former National Post editor, and it is thanks to Sutherland's professionalism and commitment to the project that they were able to do a very fast turnaround of the manuscript of the book into the finished book entitled The Big Fix, which ideally you should all be holding a copy of right now. And so, to cut to the chase, this year's lectures are being given by Denise Hearn and Vass Bednar, and their theme is how corporate concentration is growing across many Canadian industries. So when Canadians complain about high grocery prices or cell phone rates or banking fees, what we're really talking about is corporate power. But beyond the grocers, the telecoms, and the banks, more and more of the Canadian economy is controlled by only a handful of big companies in everything from funeral services to fertilizer. And so in this engaging session tonight, our speakers will detail the rise of what they call everything companies, firms that aggressively expand their reach across diverse ecosystems, aiming to own and control critical assets in multiple sectors. And these companies increasingly maintain an illusion of rivalry to disguise just how concentrated their markets have become. And so it gives me great pleasure to introduce Denise Hearn and Vass Bednar to deliver tonight's lecture, New Monopolies, The Rise of Everything Companies. Denise Hearn is an author, an applied researcher, and advisor focused on how economic power and paradigms shape our world. She is a resident senior fellow at the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment at Columbia University, and she co-authored The Myth of Capitalism, Monopolies and the Death of Competition, which was named a Financial Times Best Book of 2018. Vass Bednar is the Executive Director of McMaster University's Masters of Public Policy and Digital Society program. Her work focuses on the intersections between policy and innovation ecosystems. She's a senior fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation, and she writes the popular newsletter, Regs to Riches. After the lecture, they will be joined on stage for a conversation with the CBC's Paul Haavardsrud, who is host of the Radio 1 show and podcast, The Cost of Living. And we'll end the evening with any questions from the audience. There's microphones to the left and to the right. And after that, I hope you'll join us outside for some drinks and some milling about and a bit of food. So I think, Denise, we're going to start with you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. So nice to see you. Thank you for coming. And also thank you so much to Max Bell and to McGill for all the logistics and support of making this night happen, particularly Andrew and Adriana, who you probably met, who gave you a book when you walked in. So let's get started. A couple of years ago, I was living in London in the UK, and I used to work close to a market called Spitalfields Market. Has anyone been to London? Has anyone been to that market? Oh, nice. Okay. So for those of you who have been there, you know that it's this bustling place in central London, right near Liverpool Street Station. They have lots of, bars and restaurants and shops, and they also do this fantastic antiques market once a week, where people bring all their, ancient curios, and you can go through the aisles and find treasures. And when I was back visiting not too long ago, I noticed that a new tenant had moved in to Spitalfields Market, and it really surprised me and it shocked me, which you can see up here. So it was an Amazon store, and it wasn't a grocery store, and it wasn't, an Amazon retail store. It was a hair salon. And I thought to myself, well, this is curious, and also, I had to do my research, so I went. And I actually went with Vicky from Corliss, of those of you who know Vicky. And it was interesting because you had to sign in with your Amazon account, and when I compared the prices of the different services that they were offering, it was about 10 to 15 pounds cheaper than all of the independent hair salons in the area. And I thought to myself, why in the world is Amazon, an e-commerce giant, logistics machine, opening a hair salon in central London? Like, why? And I think it's kind of the perfect illustration of the fact that Amazon now is the quintessential everything company. So Amazon isn't just interested in what you buy online, but in fact, when Jeff Bezos was just getting started, he envisioned that Amazon would be what he called a daily habit. So any time that you spent money, from waking to sleeping, whether it was, brushing your teeth, to what you're reading on your Kindle, to what you're watching on Amazon TV, that you would interact with the company in every instance possible, and that this would create a kind of flywheel for Amazon's business model. And so when we look at the diverse collection of assets that Amazon owns, it really starts to bring this to the fore. Also, this was an interesting book, that came out in 2013, so that was more than 10 years ago, and it called Amazon the Everything Store. And what we're saying is that it's no longer just an everything store, it is now an everything company. So when you look at its diverse, set of assets, first, we've got media and entertainment. So not only Prime Video, but they own IMDb, they own Audible, of course, MGM Studios, Goodreads, and so on and so forth. Twitch, very popular gaming, streaming. You can tell I don't game. Whatever that happens on there. Also e-commerce, they've owned Zappos, obviously Prime Now, and so on. They've also gotten into healthcare, so they have a direct-to-consumer healthcare where you can order prescription drugs, directly through Amazon through PillPack. They also have a pharmacy. Grocery, Amazon Go, of course. They acquired Whole Foods, which was, made quite a bit the headlines a number of years ago. They also have in-home devices and services, so Ring cameras, Alexa. And so even here, you can see that, again, they know sort of what you watch, what you eat, what your prescriptions are, and so on and so forth. But it doesn't stop there. We've got a whole other slide. Here we have, the various tech stacks. So they have AWS and cloud computing, logistics. So everything from the manufacturing of a good and how it gets to your doorstep. They sort of want to own that entire chain of ecosystems of transportation. So they have robotics. They were going to do drone delivery for a while. I don't know where that landed. And then they also have a number of private labels. So when you go on Amazon to shop for something, I think most of us know that they own Amazon Basics products, but they also own a lot of products that go undisclosed as Amazon owned. So those are a few of them there. And then, of course, they have other household services. So again, here's the daily habit in action. And you could say, well, what's so wrong with that? Isn't it more economical? Isn't it more efficient? And I think there are certainly, many of us love Amazon. It is an amazing company. What it has done is truly astounding. But of course, that has come with trade-offs and with costs. And I think, when Jeff Bezos described this kind of flywheel, he was also talking about the kind of data that he could get from essentially spying on, everything that you do from waking to sleeping, enveloping you in the Amazon ecosystem. So the point we want to raise here is that, the way that companies compete has really changed. And they've gone from competing within a single industry and trying to monopolize one industry to owning assets across industries. And that is a profound shift, and that's something that we need to be paying attention to. Because when we talk about competition in Canada, we're used to, as people, I think as Andrew was mentioning earlier, talking about we've got 3 telecoms, we've got 2 airlines, 5 banks, and there's sort of the oligopolist in a trench coat. And that is true. We have 5 banks that control about 85% of the banking market in Canada. We have 2 companies, WestJet and Air Canada. I have a personal beef with WestJet right now because I'm trying to check in with my flight and there are endless error messages and I could not get through on customer service. So they control about 79% of all the air traffic in Canada. Lesser known is that we have 4 companies which control 95% of the fertilizer market. And when you look at different slices of the fertilizer market, it actually becomes 4 companies that also own 100%. One of those is Canadian, 2 are US based, and 1 is Norwegian. And then we also have 2 companies which control 99% of meat packing or beef slaughter capacity in Canada. So there's many industries in which this kind of concentration has really accelerated over the last few decades. And as Andrew also mentioned, in everything from fertilizers to funeral homes, to insurance, and on and on and on it goes, from sort of decades of unchallenged mergers and acquisitions. And there was actually a report that came out last year from the Competition Bureau and Stats Canada that showed that concentration in half of Canadian industries has increased by 40% since the 1980s. So when you look at the macro data, it's definitely telling the same story. Now, why is this a problem? Is it really all that bad? And I think we want to say that, of course, there are instances where we're not saying that big is bad, okay? Big can be good, it can be efficient in some instances, but when you look again at the macro data, I think we all feel this in our day-to-day lives. Why do markets, feel rigged? Why does the economy feel so difficult for me as a consumer or a worker? And when you start to actually look at the effects of concentration at the macro level, you can see that there are a number of things that concentration leads to. And so we've listed them here. So one is high prices. So when you are a consumer and you don't have any other options to take your business elsewhere, companies can use that to their advantage. They can use their market power because you have high switching costs or there's nowhere to switch to, so they can charge you higher prices. If you are a worker, and you can't take your labor elsewhere, that can also depress wages and lead to, less worker bargaining power. And of course, those 2 things combined can lead to higher inequality, where you have just, a few sort of owners of assets and, the rest of us trying to bargain against a monopolist or an oligopolist doesn't really work very well.
You can have also less innovation and fewer startups because it's harder to start a business and compete with these big incumbents. And that can lead to stagnant growth and less productivity. And we also see that in the data that, Canada's entrepreneurship rates, the kind of firm exit and entry is what they call it, has been declining basically since the 1980s. Higher inflation, and then of course there's the non-economic thing. So when Facebook says, oh, you want you want us to pay publishers, well, actually we're just going to totally rescind your access to information and your access to news. That weakens our democracy, and they can hold entire countries hostage, which we've seen in Canada. So that's one example. But again, when you have these really large firms sort of imposing their own their own will and their own agenda on the public in an anti-democratic way, that can be really problematic. So what's the fix? I mean, we often hear that more competition is the thing that will fix this problem. And we certainly are believers in more competition, obviously. We wouldn't be, in this gig if we didn't. But we also think that it's a little bit more complicated than that. And I'm going to bring up Vass in just a second to talk to us about that. But we just want to make the point that, we're used to seeing these types of headlines that really say, well, we just need more competition. More competition is going to fix all of these problems. And we called our book, The Big Fix, to sort of play with that idea. So, Vass, do you want to come up? Sure. Okay, great. Oh, thank you.
Thanks. I'll take the clicker instead. I think I'm going to stick around up here. When we made this slide, I was like, Denise, don't put one of our op-eds there. It's going to get awkward. Now, I'm going to use a big word, right? The M word, monopoly. And if you're one of my reply guys, not if you're in the room, but if you're watching, Stu, feel free to zoom in on me here. I can feel that you're about to write a comment on the YouTube, right? Monopoly is a very specific word. And we're not just using it in the sense that the companies I'm about to talk to you about in Canada are the one, the only, the most all-time dominant companies in their field. What we're putting forward is that the way companies accrue and protect and exert their market power has fundamentally shifted. And why? Because they're ripping a page from Big Tech's playbook. They read Brad Stone's book, and they got inspired. This next company, unfortunately, does not have a hair salon, but it's still worth thinking about. TELUS. Now, TELUS is a fascinating company, and we're not putting this slide forward to say, again, to use the B word, that there's anything bad about TELUS, but there's certainly something different. Back to telecom and that slide you saw from Denise. We sure don't have a lot of competition in telecom, do we? But is TELUS just a telecom company? One of the things that blew Denise's mind in particular is that it's the number 2 pharmacy benefit manager in Canada. That means it's one of the middlemen between you, your insurer, and your pharmacy. So is it a telecommunications company? Now, when we think of it as just a telecommunications company, I think we're up there. We're at phone and internet, and we kind of get it. We're like, yeah, there's flanker brands. They kind of create the illusion of competition. It looks like there's more choice out there than there is. But we shop around, we negotiate different deals. TELUS is able to, in a very innovative way, use and leverage its physical and digital infrastructure to also be in the agriculture space. Now, let's be real. They're not farming, but increasingly they're providing the software for Canada's farms. They're using their satellites and other imagery to help farmers make really important decisions about when to plow, what fertilizers to use, what crops to plant, when and where. And that's important, and it's fascinating. But are they an agriculture company? Because they're also in the health space. They are part of the duopoly for our electronic medical and electronic health records. So wait, are they a health company now? It's hard to know. They're also internationally in the business space. So this kind of foundational element of Canada's competition law that starts to say, well, the first thing we have to do is define the relevant marketplace and understand where someone's directly competing. When you bang on that drum for we need more competition, we just need one more foreign competitor, what are they competing against? Pick your poison. Now, this next company is one of Canada's all-time favorites. You know which one I'm going to bring forward, and we need a heritage minute for it, at least this year. Guys, it's Loblaw, right? Now, Loblaw is, for a range of reasons, kind of become this punching bag for Canada right now, right? There's a lot of memes, there's a lot of jokes, there's a very popular subreddit. Sorry, this is better when I'm closer to this microphone. There's a very popular subreddit, right, that Loblaw is out of control. What do we talk about when we talk about Loblaw? On the one hand, I think we talk about its suite of grocery stores. Denise and I think it's pretty hilarious that one of their grocery store brands is called Independent. But they want you to think that when you go to a T&T, that you're going to a completely different store. But you're not. Denise mentioned Amazon's independent brands, right? Privately owned brands, brands that they can self-preference, they can elevate in search, they can use to mimic popular products and kind of knock them off. We know most of these, I think, intuitively. And by the way, private labels kind of get a bad rap. And I do feel partially responsible for that in some of our own writing and research. And I don't begrudge anyone for engaging with them. I have many of these products in my pantry too. But they contribute to the illusion of rivalry that can also introduce a dangerous complacency for us as consumers, but for independent suppliers who are competing, who are trying to get on the shelves. There's not as much competition as you think in grocery. But wait a minute, maybe Loblaw's kind of like in the health field. They've got a health app, they're engaged in health insurance, they're collecting information about you, they're incentivizing particular behaviors. I actually think it might compete with TELUS because they have a white label cell phone plan that I can get. They're in the banking space. Now, sometimes companies are playing in the data space by being very overt about that exchange that they're making with us. They're making a bargain where if we trade them our privacy, they'll relabel or white label that as loyalty, right? Collecting information about our preferences, our price thresholds, and what we're purchasing, where we're going, and when. Is this inherently, let me go back to that B word, is this bad? No, but it's different. And it creates new challenges for us and new challenges for other companies. But huge challenges for the way that we've been conducting Canada's competition regime since the 80s. Previously, Loblaw was a grocery store. I checked this out on Wikipedia. The company kicked off in 1919. Those private labels I was talking about actually didn't come around to the mid-90s. But now Loblaw has a grocery store. And when we lament, right, that lack of competition or sort of marvel at the concentration in Canada over time, we miss the realities of how companies are actually competing, how hard it is to get on a shelf, why we don't have a new foreign competitor kicking down the door trying to get here. And when we say that we want more competition, I don't think we want more of the same. Now, I love Trader Joe's. I like their snacks. I read a whole book about them. But if we were to get a Trader Joe's here in Canada, we'd be welcoming a store, excuse me, I'm going to cough. I mean, I could, but I think I might. Hang on. Thank you. Cough break for everyone. It's like a stretch break. If we were to welcome a Trader Joe's, we'd welcome a store that has 85% or more, so sorry, private label products. Is that the more competition that we want? Increasingly, these stores in scope and scale like one of the all-time biggest digital companies out there? No, not in scope and scale, okay? But in structure, in ambition, in the embedded surveillance, they are. And this is just some of how Google is active in our lives, to mirror the Amazon element, okay? To mirror the structure, the reliance on data, and the everythingness in terms of touch points and our everyday lives. I would say my personal favorite there, Fitbit. Okay, why does it matter? I've sort of been alluding both to us and competitors. Of course, there are also elements for workers, but it starts to introduce fundamentally new questions, right? If we don't stretch and expand the conversation, if we're not realistic about how and when competition is occurring to the extent that it's there, we're going to totally miss out on the solutions. If you're a potential competitor in this space, if you're thinking about starting a business, trying to enter one of these markets, innovation is pretty dampened. There's not a lot of incentive to create a better product or a better service. Relevant markets become far less relevant. They become almost impossible to accurately define, or they force us to kind of endlessly debate kind of how we constrain and either expand those markets or make them irrationally narrow. And for us, we kind of start to get locked in. Some people feel that way. I think about loyalty programs and grocery, that they might as well, or, those choices are inescapable. And I think that was part of the tension with the Loblaw boycott earlier this year, right? That the inescapability, or the fact that people sort of wanted to express a resistance or a resentment towards a particular company, again, for a range of reasons, but found that difficult to actually do in practice. What's the big fix? The big fix is a triple entendre. The first gesture at the big fix, Denise actually already alluded to. There are these big fixes that lurk out there, these kind of zombie ideas that are always worth our conversation and scrutiny, but they're not the big fixes that people think they are. In fact, if you're a company that competes like this, you're very happy that every now and then Canada trips over itself to talk about whether we need to unleash the power of poultry in our economy and end supply management, or again, just break that glass, one click, click here to change the economy and allow more foreign competition in a particular market. These are important elements of the conversation, but they're not the big fixes. People hope they are. The second big fix is just, or element of it, is just how these markets increasingly feel rigged, or you feel stuck. You can't move out of them, you can't enter them, or you're pressured to exit them, either to be acquired as a killer acquisition, become a private label, or just sort of be turned away entirely. And the third big fix is the ambitious, positive, hopeful one. This full court press, a whole of government approach, taking some inspiration from President Biden's historic executive order that led to 72 concrete, tangible actions being brought forward. But what was fundamentally and is fundamentally a recognition that it's not just the Competition Bureau that should be responsible for thinking about how markets work, right? This is a very small element of one ministry that receives about 2 to 3% of funding. And it has a policing function, not a policy function. So we're putting forward that all ministries can be thinking about how they can make, remake, improve markets, as well as orders of government. We need a whole kind of more democratized approach. We don't really have, other than lots of Paul's work at CBC, dedicated reporting. We don't have people telling these stories of concentration in a consistent way. We don't have that storytelling in the public consciousness. We don't have enough independently every person's nightmare, right? Like, am I going to cough during the presentation? She is going to cough during the presentation.
Do you want me to?
I can bring us home. I can do it.
Okay.
But that's, ladies and gentlemen, that's why you have a co-author. And in a lot of ways, Denise, has brought this home and brought it home with me. Over the last couple of years, there have been historic amendments to Canada's competition law. So in a lot of ways, when Denise and I get up and get to talk about this opportunity, we look just as greedy as everything companies, because we're also saying more, 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 but in a very particular way. And I know I want to bring up Paul and continue a conversation about what whole of government actually looks like. But again, it's thinking outside of just the Competition Bureau. Maybe we have legislation that we're not using as effectively as we could. Maybe we can amend it. Maybe we need net new articulations. And by the way, why do we keep leaving the provinces off the hook, right? They have a huge role to play from that consumer protection lens. But I'd love to tell you more about it. I'd love to stretch, discuss with you after. So I'm gonna wrap it up here, and Paul, call you up to the stage for more conversation. Thank you so much.
I stole somebody's mic, so yeah.
All right. Well, I want to get more into everything companies in a second, but I just wanted to back up for a minute because you mentioned that concentration's been increasing. I think you said 40% by some particular date. So historically, if something has changed, how did we get to this point? If things are becoming more concentrated, what changed?
So I think a number of things changed. One of them being, the growth of the finance sector and capital markets, which I think kind of create an incentive for this type of consolidation because, when markets are consolidated, you can earn more durable rents over time. And in economics, there's sort of a distinction between, profits obviously are a good thing, and most companies, I think many companies, earn their profits from providing really great service and great products. But once you reach a certain level of market power, you can kind of coast and then make money just from, suppressing wages or increasing prices. And investors, like that because it's because they know that they're going to get that same sort of return over time or greater returns. So I think that's one element of it. And then the other thing is sort of a paradigm shift. I mean, when we started in the 1980s, you had Reagan in the US who said, the scariest words in the English language are I'm from the government and I'm here to help, right? And you had this notion that this neoliberal idea that the government, it's the best thing it can do is just get out of the way completely. And so we had this kind of like idea that markets would self-govern and they would self-correct, and that if they're left alone, that they are going to deliver, good benefits for people. And I think we now have 40 years of that running experiment, and we've realized that actually that's not how markets operate. They need guardrails. They need, they have rules, and those rules can either be set democratically or they can be set by private firms. And so, in Canada, we didn't really get a comprehensive law until the mid-'80s, but our entire competition policy regime was born out of this sort of neoliberal idea. And so, the Competition Bureau are the bureau that is supposed to be policing markets and reviewing mergers has never actually successfully blocked a merger in Canada, which is just sort of crazy when you think about it, right? So that is changing, and that's where we get a lot of hope. But I think basically that's one of the reasons why you've seen this consolidation, because the regulators were just sort of like absent, cops on the beat, if you want to use that analogy, or just non-interventionists. They just sort of thought like, we'll do some stuff here and there, but we're not really going to go after market power in a real way.
So has it been a march then? From if you look at competition policy being formed in the 80s, Reaganomics, laissez-faire capitalism, neoliberalism really taking hold, has it been a steady march towards companies getting bigger and more concentration of power? And then here we are.
Well, can I say one tiny thing about 1986, very important year, I won't say why, we were born then, when the Competition Act was brought forward, it wasn't like they thought of it in 1985 and then passed it in 1986. It was kicked down the road since the 70s. There was an attempt. So there were kind of these foundational elements that were trying to be brought forward, but there was also resistance, right? There was tension. And there's a natural tension for even how we structure how we think about competition policy in Canada, right? The very same minister that's responsible for facilitating innovation, for celebrating the growth of companies, also has to be the ambassador for this oversight role. And it doesn't always go very well together. I mentioned the US earlier, but we also constrain the voice of the Bureau in a way that we worry, limits the conversation in Canada. In the US, you will see the head of the FTC, Lena Khan, tweet the same day a major proposed merger is announced. Hey, we're going to look into this. We might have some concerns. It's a very official, she's not sharing memes or anything like that. But we're very polite in Canada. We're very reserved. I was going to say very demure, very mindful, but we don't. But again, you don't get that element of conversation. You don't get the proactive elements. In fact, recently when a US court found that Google illegally obtained its monopoly, Canada did a similar investigation a few years earlier. And we concluded that we just weren't sure. We couldn't get enough information, so case closed. Again, we didn't have the tools and the structure and the kind of power to really maybe be understanding and investigating what we needed to.
Okay, but if you think about big companies in a Canadian context, oftentimes they're celebrated, and oftentimes the conversation is around, well, we need to get...
Celebrated by who?
Great question, but I'm asking the questions, not you, Vass. No, but the idea is, look, we have to be big because we have to compete internationally. We have to be big, and so we want, whether we're picking winners or losers or whatever, but we like national champions until we let them go like Nortel or whatever. But what about that idea? I mean, doesn't big have some merits?
Yeah, for sure. And I really want to emphasize that we don't begrudge, companies getting big. I mean, most of the services that we rely on day to day, come from big companies that, and I think most people wake up every day trying to figure out how to make things work. I don't think they wake up every day trying to break things, except a few.
WestJet.
No, just like the move fast and break things. But yeah, in terms of foreign competitors, so I think, national champions, I think it's complex. And one distinction I like to try to help people make is, there are certain industries that are globally tradable. So, the digital giants, as an example, they compete globally, right? I think it's also interesting, and I'll just say this in terms of if you're Google and the U.S. is like, oh, well, Google is a, national champion. Google has operations all over the world. They have global shareholders. They're not necessarily beholden to towing, the line of the U.S. government. I mean, in many cases, actually, their interests diverge quite readily. Their business interests, right, and national security interests. And so one, I think maybe there's a little bit of a false kind of parallel sometimes in that way, where we don't acknowledge that even our national champions may not have our national interests always in mind. But then secondly, there's lots of industries where we've seen consolidation, like in vet practices or funeral homes, and you're not shopping around globally for a funeral home, right? You're going to wherever's closest in your neighborhood. And in those instances, like, consolidation just doesn't make sense. And those are, I think, great examples where the national champions argument for consolidation just really doesn't hold water.
Okay. I'm curious about this idea of companies owning assets across industries, which is something you brought up in the everything company example. If we think about a TELUS, and TELUS is expanding into agriculture, and there's TELUS Health, and it's not just a telecom. But what if TELUS, for whatever reason, decided we want to become a big conglomerate? We want to get into restaurants. We're going to buy Cara, or whatever Cara is called now, Recipe Unlimited, right? Cara owns Harvey's and Swiss Chalet and Eastside Mario's, and it owns a bunch of restaurants. So TELUS is like, we want to be restaurateurs. Okay, is there a problem with that?
So the real answer is it depends, right? I mean, when we're not thinking about how companies use data and information, like, I actually love the restaurant element you put into this question, because I don't think a lot of people realize that real estate investment trusts own certain restaurants, and that's why you always see, like, Montana's with the Jack Astor's near Cineplex, right? That's the new 3 companies in a trench coat, right? Again, how is competition occurring? How is competition not occurring? If TELUS or any one of these companies wants to expand and grow in that particular way, there shouldn't be a rule that says you can't do that. But we also need to be thinking about it. And for a very long time, regulators everywhere, not just in Canada, weren't thinking about what it meant. The US wasn't really thinking about what it could mean for, it pains me to say the company name Meta, but when Meta acquired Instagram, right? When Facebook acquired Instagram, what that could mean for the company, what that could mean for competition, what that could mean for social media. And now, with the benefit of hindsight, there are new and really important conversations about that. But these companies don't even necessarily think of themselves in that way. We have a great quote in the book that Denise found from the CEO of the Bay, who says we're a real estate company. What does that mean?
Can I just add to that?
Yeah.
Like I think there's a few harms to this. So one of them is that, companies have to grow or die, right? And I think, so when you look at a TELUS as an example, where there's already a high degree of market concentration and there's sort of a sort of tacit agreement between the top three firms that they're not really going to compete, because they don't really care if 100,000 customers go to one or the other, right? They need to find different revenue sources. And so that's why they are expanding into all these different industries. So I think one of the problems with that is that it makes it harder for new entrants. It makes it harder when more and more of the economy gets enveloped by, just a few companies, then it's really much harder for a startup to gain a foothold and to have an even playing field, which the reason why we like startups is because they provide, the most new jobs. They also are where productivity gains come from and all these things that really matter to the future economic prospects of Canada. And the other reason is that when companies get too big and kind of bulky and bureaucratic, they become less innovative and actually, the service can worsen. And so we tend to think of like a government as being really big and bulky and bureaucratic, which it is, but actually a lot of companies operate that way now too. And actually the value of the company can sort of get obscured. As an investor, it's hard to value a company that has all these different tentacles. So I think those are a few of them, and and ultimately, in some cases, they can become a little bit too big to care, right? Where it's like if they own restaurants and all these different things, healthcare and grocery and all of that, it's like how much do they really care about your experience as a customer? Because the whole idea is can we get all these assets, can we collect them, and can we gain a profit? And we obviously want to keep people happy enough, but I think that too big to care can definitely come into play.
So it's basically like companies are successful, they make a lot of money, they then use that money to buy other companies. So in the case of a TELUS, let's say they bought restaurants and they basically just suck all of the oxygen out of the restaurant ecosystem, and then that's just all owned by TELUS. And if you are the next sort of intrepid Swiss chalet restaurateur, you can't get off the ground, and that's the worry.
Yeah, and like there's also instances where companies, as Vass was talking about with Facebook and Instagram, where they acquire a competitor, to take a competitive threat off the market. I mean, Mark Zuckerberg said it's better to buy than compete, and so one example is in pharmaceuticals. Actually, I read a paper recently that was talking about how, conservatively, the researchers estimated that 5 to 8% of drug acquisitions were explicitly done to take a rival drug off the market. So this is something that could benefit patients. It might improve healthcare. It might be a better option than what's currently available, but the pharmaceutical companies are incentivized to acquire it, so they just move it to the janitor's closet and it never sees the light of day because it was competing with one of their existing products. So we see that all the time. And I think it's hard for us to imagine, like, okay, well, so what's the counterfactual? Because we don't know how many products could we have access to, how many new innovations might we have seen if markets were more competitive, if they didn't just get gobbled up, by these giant firms. But that's like a harder story to tell because we just don't know.
Well, if companies are getting too big then, and they are sort of expanding into different industries that are not their core businesses, and this is the concern, then like walk me through how that might change, because the world that we've been living in, or I've been living in, it's like, all right, tell us you want to buy restaurants, go ahead, buy restaurants. So how does that change? How does that become different?
So I think what we want to be putting forward is not that companies need to stop innovating or being creative or entering new markets, but that if from that regulatory standpoint, if from how we discuss, how we evaluate, how we measure markets and look at competition doesn't also change, to take that more expansive view, to recognize that, to appreciate the complexities of this new restaurant provision from TELUS, then we do ourselves that same disservice that we've been doing since the 80s, right? We made a big and kind of very interesting mistake kind of recently in Canada. In about 2018, we did a major paper. I know this is wonky. You're always like, Vass, try to tell stories, be funny, be relatable. Well, for me, this is being relatable. Where we said, okay, big data is so cool. Does everyone remember that moment? Like 2014, 2015, we were just like, everyone was losing their minds. Look what we can do with information. Look what we can reveal about ourselves, each other, market trends, our businesses. And the Competition Bureau did a little bit of a study together. And they said, you know what? No worries here. I'm paraphrasing, but basically this is like kind of cool, and anyone who's concerned, these concerns are kind of overblown. And I think, you said, has it been a long, slow march, kind of where are we going? I think that is an important kind of fork in our history. What needs to change? Do the companies need to change? Do they need to be broken up? Do we need to spin out elements of our grocery? If we're not realistic about what it means to both own and operate in a marketplace, the inherent structural advantages that provides, we talk about resenting gatekeepers sometimes politically, but we haven't said anything from a policy perspective about what our opinion is about companies that gatekeep and throttle access to markets. In fact, we haven't even said it's problematic at all yet.
All right, so what's the end point here? Because y'all ever see Demolition Man? Not a great movie, but basically Taco Bell is the only company in the world, essentially.
This is relatable content.
Everything is Taco Bell? Anybody? No?
Yes.
Yes, some Demolition fan, man. So is that the end point here? Is that what we're talking about? Like if this is just left, I know that's a sort of a dystopic view, science fiction view of the future, but a few big companies just gobble up everything and then that's where we are if this is left unchecked?
I mean, I think that is where we are, unfortunately, in many industries. And so I think, maybe to add to what Vass said, I just want to say that this is such an exciting time in our country. I live in the U.S. now, but I'm Canadian, also in the U.S., because we have had this 40 years of this hands-off approach, but things are really changing. And I know it can be hard to sort of, feel like they are, but over the last year and a half, as an example, Canada passed 3 rounds of changes to our competition law. And we used to have one of the weakest laws in the world. We had a loophole that made it really difficult for the Bureau to block mergers. And that's why we have never blocked any mergers through the Competition Bureau. But what's crazy is these changes passed unanimously through Parliament, okay? Can anyone name another policy issue where we get unanimous agreement that we need to strengthen our laws, that we need to challenge corporate power, that maybe we have too many mergers going on? So everyone from the NDP, Conservatives, Liberals, they all agree that this is important. And now our regulators and our legislators actually have the tools to be able to take on corporate power. And you've seen in the US, where I live, with the Federal Trade Commission, the Department of Justice, under the Biden administration, there's been this huge renaissance of antitrust. So you read about it in the news all the time now, right? And Vass and I weren't that cool 5 or 6 years ago, and we're still not that cool, but we're cooler at parties now because
this is being videoed.
I know, sorry, because because people are actually, this is part of our dinner conversation, right? This is part of what we talk about day to day, and I think people really are connecting the fact that the lack of freedom that you feel, the kind of squeeze that you feel in the economy, in your day-to-day life, is really connected to these big market power issues. And it's really about a conversation about what is the role of a corporation in society. And that's the kind of conversation, that we're trying to have with these books. And with our whole project. So I actually have a lot of hope that things are changing. And I think the pandemic and other things have shown us that, ideas that we thought were crazy, impossible to happen, 50 years off, actually, you realize in an emergency, people's minds can change quite quickly. And the ideas that we thought were never possible all of a sudden become not only possible, but probable. So I think we're in a real inflection point. I think the Overton window has shifted a lot. We used to, in the US, like I said, they used to sort of be like, government needs to get out of doing things. And now there's this whole resurgence of industrial policy. All of a sudden we're doing domestic manufacturing. All of a sudden we're doing all this stuff, which people thought would never happen. So I do think we're at a real moment of opportunity, and we're so glad that you're all here tonight, because, you know, having conversations like this is really part of helping turn that conversation into a reality.
I have some relatable content though, because when I'm not feeling optimistic, I like to eat fast food. And the dystopia you're trying to outline with Taco Bell, it's already here. Does anyone use the app? Companies want to create closed ecosystems for their own pricing as well. When you engage in this app, and there was an investigation into the Tim Hortons app through the Privacy Commissioner, Taco Bell, it's not an everything company, but it is interested in using data and information to very subtly throttle prices. Taco Bell's app knows when I get paid. And my Whopper, can you get a Whopper at Taco Bell?
No, Burger King.
Okay, what do I get? My taco, thank you. And that's why you have an audience. That price actually goes up. Again, we're not having that conversation. Economists have that conversation sometimes, and it's kind of like, it's like a dream for economists to have these experiments, right? And you can say it's very efficient. Well, that's Vass's price threshold. That's what she's going to pay that day. That's what she's willing to pay. Have you noticed when you go into fast food stores that there's more and more kiosks, kind of individualization? We're moving to a place where you may not see. We have this presumption that prices tend to be static, that we're all paying the same thing for same items. Did anyone get the Amazon Kids catalog in their mailbox recently?
Yes.
Thank you. Was that real or just for...
That was weird.
Yeah.
I might do a story on it.
Did you notice anything missing from that catalog?
Didn't flip through it enough.
Prices. Why? Because when you go to buy this is good. Like, what are you going to go buy from that catalog? Taco? No. Again, so the algorithmic pricing, that kind of personalization, is not necessarily a feature that is inherent to everything companies. It is a new business behavior. It is something that more and more companies are trying to do, that they want to do, that the longer we're silent on it, that we're not proactive, that we're not having the policy conversation, the more normal it becomes. And the more normal it becomes, we're desensitized to it. There's a kind of an inherent unknowability. But much of the world that we experience, thanks to e-commerce, through our phones and through online, is becoming this kind of Alice in Wonderland, unpredictable place. And I think there's a discomfort with that we need to think about and talk about.
But you did mention that you're hopeful because you see in this moment we're in right now a lot of change happening. One of the terms you use in the book, you quote David Leonard of the New York Times, who uses the term neopopulism to describe the moment we're in right now. I'm going to get both of you to put your prof hats on here and really smarten some things up from Taco Bell.
I'm still at Taco Bell.
You're still at Taco Bell, all right. But can you explain not just neopopulism, if that's the moment we're in right now, but also what that is a shift from, where we were and what we're coming from, and what neopopulism is then?
I guess I see it when we're working on competition policy, it can sometimes make for strange bedfellows because, again, in the U.S., as an example, J.D. Vance, Trump's running mate, I was at an event in D.C. in February, and he said that he thought Lina Khan, who runs the Federal Trade Commission, was Biden's, one of his only good decisions, essentially. So he's very supportive of more antitrust enforcement. And conservatives also, people don't realize, but under Trump, actually, he started some of the big tech investigations and actually sued Facebook, and because conservatives feel like big tech is censoring conservative voices, right? And so there's they have a desire to sort of take on corporate power from a censorship perspective. On the left, then you have people who are trying to stop, break up Ticketmaster or stop the Kroger-Albertsons merger as an example, because they want to ensure that workers have better mobility and better wages. The FTC imposed a non-compete ban across the whole country. So I guess what I'm saying is, there's popular anger. People realize things are broken. I think we've known that for a long time. But what's interesting about this moment is that you can no longer divide this by left or right. And actually that a lot of people are now
recognizing the problem is these concentrated choke points in markets. And just to make this also real, like one of the projects that I started was called Access to Markets. And we spoke to entrepreneurs, farmers, independent pharmacists, Silicon Valley guys doing new, cloud storage startups. We talked to a guy that was doing, direct to consumer beef. We talked to so many different people, like so interesting, right? But and a lot of them, a lot of small business owners in the U.S. are Republican, but they were all sitting around saying, Lena Khan and Jonathan Cantor are at antitrust is our only hope, and they were really excited to engage in this policy process because they all had to deal with some horrible gatekeeper that made their lives really, challenging. Maybe an Amazon seller that can't actually, they're competing against Amazon, the very company they're reliant on. They all have to pay more and more for advertising to get up in the search rankings and so on and so forth. So, I think what's interesting about this moment is that people recognize corporate power as a problem. And it doesn't matter if you're on the left or right or somewhere in the middle. And they also recognize that we have the tools at our disposal to take this on, and it's really a matter of political will. And I think when we use our voices and we actually, go and talk and participate in these conversations and talk to policymakers and say, like, we care about this, please do something about it, that's when things start to change.
Well, what are we seeing in Canada right now? I mean, competition policy, something big happened recently. Was it big?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen this momentum, right? A series of legislative changes, kind of the government being very ambitious, taking and making opportunities, sometimes really aggravating business in doing that, right? Tucking in some amendments to an omnibus bill, to a budget bill, but sort of saying, okay, here's a moment, here's this kind of stepladder or staircase where we're going to start to modernize this law. We had a comprehensive consultation. I know, eyes glazing over. Take us back to Taco Bell. But we said, hey, what should the future of competition policy be in Canada? How do we improve this one major piece of legislation that we have? But if you start to look around at Canada, we have a lot of the scaffolding there. I think you could frame controversial pieces of legislation, but still very important and recent. C11, the Online Streaming Act. C18, the Online News Act, actually reads like a remedy from a competition case, right? The Online Streaming Act starting to say, okay, pushing back against opaque algorithmic control, these rules set by private companies controlling and constraining what we see, what we hear, what we listen to, and when. Actually, Canada said there's a role for the state here, and we can talk about that and disagree with that, but that's how you start to broaden the umbrella of competition policy. The CRTC has made important changes. Hopefully our roaming charges are going to start to go down. And I think what you saw with President Biden's executive order is that drumbeat, right? That in aggregate, these changes that look modest but meaningful, I mean, making insulin more affordable, making hearing aids more affordable and accessible, are huge, are wins in and of themselves, but are kind of tiny elements that may not ever make it on your top 5 or top 10 scorecard. So Denise and I want to also make sure we call out what Canada gets right. We have federally been working on junk fees, on removing junk fees. That case recently with Cineplex, I think some people kind of rolled their eyes at that $1.50 fee if you book a movie ticket online. The Competition Bureau said, hold the phone. You are engaging in false and misleading advertising. You're advertising a price online that is fundamentally unattainable online. And it was just for $1.50. And of course, Cineplex fought back and said, if you scroll here, if you click here, if you zoom in, we said something. These fees also have really fancy names. I don't know, administrative fee, service fee. They capitalize on our trust that we're not going to blink, that we're going to click through. And by pushing back, by our Competition Bureau taking that on, I think the Competition Bureau becomes a bit of a punching bag too sometimes, where people, are like, oh, they need to do more, or, where is Commissioner Boswell on this? I took a lot of hope from that case because I saw Canada as saying, we see you, we see companies who are doing this. It's not cool, it's not appropriate. It sends a very important signal to other companies that are doing that. So a long-winded, meandering answer to what is Canada already doing. We have the scaffolding there for more of a whole-of-government approach, but we haven't shared that vision. It's been very fractal, very one-off, and very sector-specific, right? Grocery, telecom, banking, and that's because I think we're not doing the work of calling on the provinces and calling on other ministries to be more proactive and thoughtful in their spaces.
Well, is that the big fix then? This whole government approach that you're talking about? Is that what's going to move things in a meaningfully in the direction you think they should move?
I mean, that's what we wrote in the book, so yeah.
And
well, good that you think that then.
Zoom in, fade, end conversation. No.
Yeah, I mean, and I think, I have a bit of nervousness about the phrase whole of government, because I think it's sort of like everyone rolls their eyes and they're like, oh my gosh, you're advocating more.
You're stealing my eye roll. I was about to eye roll at you because, we
Yeah,
hear that
like
a lot. We
red
hear that with housing.
tape.
We need a whole of government approach for housing. We need a whole of government approach for climate change. We have a lot of generational issues, and I hear you say whole of government approach, and I'm like,
But we actually spell it out too.
Yeah, you
Oh,
do.
sorry.
I think why we think this is important is because the way that markets are structured really, really matters. And it's not, you can't just have one small bureau dealing with the biggest question of our time, which is like, what is the relationship between the state and a corporation, and this, and the state and markets. And so, because this impacts everything from IP to labor law to trade negotiations, to telecom, all of these different things. And so what we're saying is that we want every ministry to be thinking about competition where concentration is making outcomes worse for Canadians, where it's impacting national security, where it's making our supply chains more fragile and less resilient to shocks, and actively thinking about this, and then also taking action within their jurisdiction, within their mandate, to actually, make markets more fair and more free. And so, thank you. That was great. So I think, this whole of government approach, yes, it might sound idealistic, but we do think that there's a blueprint already and there's momentum. And so we want to capitalize and build on that momentum. And we think there's a moment of opportunity in Canada to do that. And we've seen it done in the US and in other jurisdictions. And so we think there's also, lessons to draw from, that we don't have to start from square one.
Do you remember when Manulife and Loblaw announced their unique, one-of-a-kind partnership earlier this year for particular insurance plans? It might be a little bit Ontario specific, but people roared, right? Back to the neo-populism, the anger, reactions. People kind of intuitively felt that was suboptimal for them, for consumers. That potential partnership was walked back. In Quebec, back to whole of government, back to what could provinces be doing, Quebec actually explicitly outlaws that kind of integration and has proactively said, we want to prevent this from occurring because it's not going to be good for competition. Right?
What it was that basically Manulife said that if you have prescription drugs for chronic health issues, so things like Crohn's disease or certain cancers, which are don't make up a lot of drug claims in Canada, but they're the really expensive drugs. And they were only, if you were a patient that needed those drugs, you could only get them through a Loblaw pharmacy. And people got really mad about that because they were like, well, what about people living rurally that don't, that live really far away, or you're restricting my access. All of a sudden you're saying that I can't go to any pharmacy and get my, the needed medication that I need. And so that's what Vass is referring to. And there was a public outcry, and also the Competition Bureau said, we think this is anti-competitive. And so they walked back the deal. So I think what's important is these types of little corporate power grabs happen every second of every day. And we don't want it to be left up to the consumer to have to push back on every single thing, right? That's why you need regulators. That's why you need strong laws. And is it enough? Of course, it's never enough, but you and me should not be policing markets every day, right? We need like a strong state to help us do that in certain instances.
All right, well, last question from me, and then I'll open it up to questions from the audience. If you're someone who would say, yeah, Vass, Denise, you're right. I agree with everything you're saying about concentration of power.
That's a lot of people.
That's a lot of people. A lot of people think that. A lot of people think that. They think, yes,
Many
absolutely.
are saying.
Many people are saying this is a problem, but that same person is also very skeptical that there is going to be a whole government approach, that some of the things you're talking about is like, okay, well, this is happening, and this is happening, but really, government has a lot on its plate, and does it really have it's not good at holistic thinking. So yeah, I think some of your policy prescriptions aren't really going to be, taken up and ran with. What would you say to that person that would make them more hopeful?
Paul, you're such a downer.
We know it's you. We know it's you, Paul. No.
You pierced through the veil.
You're like asking for a friend. No. No, I think, listen, I think if anyone, and I'm sure many of you in this room are working on things that are really hard and seem impossible, and maybe it's kind of masochistic, but we couldn't do this if we weren't optimistic that change was possible and if we hadn't actually seen it before. And so, I don't know if I can say this, but Vass has been invited to, present at a pretty high level our ideas. And I do think that there's a lot of appetite. I think there's this great Milton Friedman quote, actually, and I'm not apt to quote Milton Friedman often, but he actually said, it's only in times of crisis, I'm going to paraphrase here, that things change. But our job is to make sure that we have the policy ideas laying around so that when the moment of opportunity arises and people are looking around for ideas, your ideas are ready to go. And so we do think that moment of opportunity is now. And that's why we are optimistic that, of course, not everything we outline is going to happen, and hopefully not, because I'm sure we're wrong on a bunch of stuff. But, we do think that if we could even get half of this agenda, that would make a real difference for Canadians. And not always in the immediate term, but this kind of change does take a while. Sometimes it's generational, but that's what we're here to do.
And I do think it's a terrible feeling to feel that powerlessness, to feel, again, back to the memes and kind of the merch, by the way, some of which I've purchased, some of which we feature in the book. When we're stuck in that problem space and sort of just expressing that constraint, it's harder to see what's possible. It's harder to remember that we are the ones with power too, not just democratic, but also as consumers, right, who can, even within kind of a restricted choice set, be making choices and demonstrating them. And also back to the journalism and the storytelling that I mentioned. I know Brian Carney from the Tyee is here, and he did some reporting on price fixing and meat, and that it might not actually be just in the bread sector that we saw years ago. Again, without this kind of investigative journalism, without more of this research, we even lack that appreciation of where the opportunities are, because the opportunities are absolutely there. And I think it is about that full court press and that radical incrementalism to start to realize them and kind of remake Canada.
All right, I'm convinced. Hopeful as all get out. Thank you for all that questions.
See you at Taco Bell.
We have microphones on both sides. And there will be a free gordita for the first question. So.
Ooh, woohoo. Nice.
Vass is buying.
Hey, Vass. Hey, Denise. This is on. Can you hear me?
Hey,
yeah.
You need this, right?
Hi.
You brought up that Reagan quote, and I have another saying from that time, which I'm positive is from there, which is personnel is policy, right?
Oh,
and that's
nice.
from like the Reagan years. That was all like the rage back then. This is like personal for me because like I just spent a few years in government. Now I'm away doing private sector stuff, right? So like I understand this.
Thank
of,
you
like,
for your service.
Who's in charge, not just at the top level, but as staffers is critical, right? So I want to talk to or get Vass's perspective of training the new generation of policymakers from the program that you're affiliated with, right? Because what we were doing is we were combating and trying to argue against MBAs, JDs, and economists, right? And it's hard to do that. if you're not trained like that. And, you know, Vass is doing that right now, and I'm glad she is.
You know, when there was this moment 4 years ago where McGill asked me to write a paper on the state of competition policy in Canada, and as I told them that I could do that, with my wired headset in, I Googled what is competition policy. And I think the person on the phone heard me typing, and they're like, Vass, do you know anything about this? And I was like, you know, I know a bit, which was true, but I want to learn more, also true. And for too long, in policy land, we've left competition to lawyers, to economists. We've allowed it to be very esoteric. We even lack the text sometimes, right? But the big fix is a great text if you're studying and you want to get a lay of the land. So the training and the exposure, but also that message that it is for everyone. During the pandemic, Robin Chabon, who's one of the co-founders of the Canadian Anti-Monopoly Project, started an informal reading group where, I'm going to be honest, on Wednesday nights, we would read the Competition Act. And we would talk about it, right? So this kind of learning, where we'd say, can we just, one night we spent, you know, just on one section, like one paragraph. So you're very right to say the training, the opportunity, but I think that really relates to the storytelling, the information, what's in the newspaper, right? Chris Haney's work, Armin Yalzinian's work on private equity in Canada. These are just two people who are starting to talk about where those forces are and help kind of reveal them to us. It's really important, but it's not enough. That's what we need more of.
I'll just add, and yeah, thank you so much. That was such a lovely question, and I think Vass is doing an amazing job. That one of the other constraints is, you know, is that sometimes you can have a very conservative judiciary, right? That and so it isn't just about training MPPs. It's also about training economists in, you know, in non-neoclassical economics. It's also about training judges. And what's interesting, and I'm so sorry that I bring up so many U.S. things, but you know, I live there now and I've done a lot of work, and so that's like more easily available in my mind. But, you know, in the US at one of the universities, there is called the Global Antitrust Institute. And basically it was a way that conservatives would train, you know, all the competition regulators globally. They bring them in, they give them fancy titles, they do week-long seminars for them in the summer and so on. And this has been a 40-year project. And this is how they've influenced, they've had intellectual capture, you know, over regulators, over the judiciary. And so I think these things really matter. Your question is so important. How do you think about institutionalizing new ways of thinking and training new leaders so that when they are in the positions of power, they have new tools and they have new ways of viewing the world that, you know, better reflect how the world actually operates now? Is everyone ready for drinks? Let's do it. Yeah. Unless we haven't, sorry.
Sorry for delay.
2 gorditas.
Sorry for the delay on the drinks, everyone. Denise, Vass, thanks first of all for coming all the way to Vancouver, and thanks for the book as well too. My question is, and Vass, thanks for bringing this point up earlier during your talk, that the Competition Bureau is under the Ministry of ISED, or under the Ministry of Innovation right now, and it does create problem of a conflict of interest for that minister specifically. So I was wondering what your thoughts are on should there be other ways to make it arm's length, or should it be under a whole other ministry? Because it's not just that the minister doesn't want to hamper the Competition Bureau, but also like there's problems of like funding where they have to choose within their ministry, where is that funding going to go? Is it going to go to creating more innovation opportunities, or is it going to go to the Bureau? Mm-hmm. So those are... That's
a great question. I think in the past we have talked about the idea of moving the Competition Bureau out of ISED and making it fully independent, which we think would be a good thing. And we tried to do some research with our RAs, and we'd love someone to fact check us on this. But when we looked at the numbers, it appeared as though the Competition Bureau is only around 2 to 3% of, I think you mentioned this, sorry, so I'm repeating, but 2 to 3% of the ISED budget. And so when you think about that, that's really minuscule, right? And we're talking about an agency that is supposed to police the entire Canadian economy and deal with every, merger that's over, $100 million. And basically their funding hasn't increased at all, even though mergers and acquisitions have gone like this. So I think that's a really important question. And so we do think, one, they of course need more funding, and two, we do think it would be good for them to get out from ISED, because those ministries can work at cross purposes from one another. So yeah, I don't know if you want to add anything, but.
No, I would say that's basically it. When we talk about empowering the Bureau has been empowered with a bit more funding in the last budget, and new powers, new really important. I know whenever I say new powers, it does make me think of superpowers. I can't help it. But these things called market study powers, where now we don't have to be Canadian when we conduct an investigation. Previously, the Competition Bureau strategy was a very polite, do you mind giving us this very important business information? To which businesses could say no, but now we have the power to kind of compel the information that the Bureau wants and needs. And some are speculating, back to many are saying, that the Competition Bureau may actually redo its grocery study with these new market powers, because we were unable to see certain companies were conflating their pharmacy earnings with their grocery earnings, and we weren't really able to get a full picture of what was happening there. And that goes to that bigger kind of concurrent conversation we're having about inflation and sellers inflation, and whether firms of all sizes, but the largest firms, have taken advantage of that shock in the pandemic to jack their prices and keep them high. But I do see Andrew approaching from the wings.
Are there any more questions? No? So should we, look, I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight. I want to thank Vass and Denise. Thanks to Paul. Thanks to UBC for the great space. We have food and drink outside for anyone who wants to stick around. I think Vass and Denise might sign some books and chit-chat. And all I'll say is, Paul, thank you so much for mentioning Demolition Man. I was sitting there going, Demolition Man, Demolition Man. So thank you guys very much. Let's have a hand of applause for everyone tonight. Thank you.